you will find that there are more romance novels about vampires than any other subject. You know, they might have romance novels about Highlanders from Scotland, or they might have romance novels about pirates, or, you know, or noblemen, or whatever the case might be. But right now it's like more than 2/3 of the books that are out there in the genre of vampire fiction, of romance fiction, are about vampires. So again, this shows how this whole thing has crept into the culture and has become obviously very successful. It is said that the romance genre among women is sort of the female equivalent of pornography for men, because it fulfills certain romantic desires for lonely women, you know, and all this stuff. I don't know if that's true or not, but I do know, to me, it's very worrisome that all of a sudden it's being populated 2-to-1 in favor of vampires now in your local bookstore. Okay. Since that time, we have more and more of this showing up. Probably the next big example would be Anne Rice's series of books, The Vampire Chronicles, the most well-known of which was Interview with a Vampire, which also became a hit movie. And of all things, it starred Tom Cruise and Brad Pitt, who are two of the major heartthrobs in Hollywood, as two vampires in 19th century Louisiana and then Europe. So since that time, we've had all sorts of this stuff going on. And now, the most recent example are these Twilight novels, which are, again, targeted for young people, especially teen girls. It has been basically said that those novels are essentially targeting, 12 to 17-year-old girls. And I did wade through them, and yeah, they are. They definitely are. So here you have young, impressionable girls reading a novel about a girl just like them who develops, and we're going to talk more about this novel later, but crush on this 6-year-old vampire that looks like he's 17 years old. There you see, that's the poster from the first of the vampire films. And all of these things are showing vampires to basically be dark, romantic, but basically good. The kind of vampire you'd want to invite home to meet your mother. That kind of vampire. So, just don't serve garlic, okay? All right. Now, in film, there's a similar evolution. The first notable vampire film was a silent film by a guy named F.W. Murnau in 1922. It was called Nosferatu. Nosferatu is a Romanian word for undead. And he wanted to call it Dracula, but the estate of Bram Stoker would not let him use the rights. So, if you see the movie, and of course it's a silent film, it's like, 80 years old, but it still stands up. It's got all the essential elements of a vampire film. It even has some special effects. And the guy that played the part of the vampire, Count Orlok, he couldn't be called Count Dracula because Bram Stoker's estate would have sued them. So he's called Count Orlok. He turns in an amazingly creepy performance. As you can see, he was repulsive. He had this really weird shovel-shaped face. He had like rodent teeth, ears that would make Mr. Spock totally jealous. And there's this one scene that just totally creeps you out to this very day where he rises from the coffin. What they did is they put a board behind him. And he's like this, he goes out of the coffin like that. And, this is 1922. That totally freaked people out. So, anyway, this was the first cinematic vampire. Then the next thing that came along, of course, was there was a relatively unknown Hungarian actor named Bela Lugosi. And Lugosi was cast on the stage in the play Dracula. He was a natural because he was a native of Hungary. In fact, originally, he didn't even speak English. He had to memorize his lines in English, even though he only spoke Hungarian. Of course, he had the famous Hungarian accent. And, and so many of the things that we now associate with Dracula, he had on the stage, and then later on they made a film out of it. And that film was just a huge success. And he was the first time we ever saw, now mind you, Bela Lugosi could not really be called handsome. As you can see from the picture there, he was kind of a menacing, dark-looking guy, but yet he was very continental, he was very smooth-looking, and he had a certain class, he had a certain presence. And of course, it didn't hurt that he being from the stage was shamelessly overacting, you know. But that was how films were in those days. And people were literally fainting in the aisles of the theater. They were so terrified by this film. If you see it today, I mean, it's totally, but that's how much we've deteriorated in our approach to horror in the last 50 years. So anyway, 50 years, more like 80 years. Anyway, he projected a very sophisticated vampire for the first time. Then the next big milestone was the Hammer Film Studio in England in the 1950s produced a series of color horror films. It's the first time horror films had ever been done in color. And some of you may have seen these on TV or even in theaters if you're old enough. And their film Dracula in 1958 had Christopher Lee, who was very handsome, and he really had a very magnetic personality. And again, they were moving more in the direction of a good-looking, suave, debonair type figure. Then the next guy, and I call him the first matinee idol, was Frank Langella, an actor that's still around to this day. In fact, he was nominated for an Oscar for playing Nixon in that Frost-Nixon film. Anyhow, in 1979, he played Dracula after doing it on the stage. Was a huge hit. Many people say this is probably the most successful film portrayal of the Dracula novel. There are other versions I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. Most notably, Francis Ford Coppola, who did the Godfather series, which is considered by many to be the greatest film of all time. He did a version. It was called Bram Stoker's Dracula, which is very artsy, very bloody, very perverse, but extraordinary film. And but the point I want to make through all of this is that gradually vampires have made more and more sexually appealing and pretend to be portrayed more and more as anti-heroes or even heroes. And they're increasingly targeting young people, teen audiences. Now, I would submit to you that vampires are real, but not in the way you see in Hollywood. They don't have all of these powers, as I mentioned earlier, but there are really people out there that are into this stuff. It is a kind of what is called in psychology a fetish, a sexual fetish. They get turned on by drinking one another's blood. And there's different classes of them, believe it or not. There's actually vampire churches, believe it or not. There's various websites you can get onto you can have vampire blogs, vampire chat rooms, all this stuff. And there's psychic vampires. There's vampires that are sanguinarians. That's the word they use. You have vegetarians, people who don't eat meat. Well, sanguinarians, sanguine is, of course, from the Latin word for blood. And these people actually drink blood. Now, they don't bite people in the neck necessarily. They take, a scalpel or razor blade, and it's all very clinical, and it's all very clean, and they cut a vein somewhere, and they drink each other's blood. And these people claim that this is the ultimate form of sexual intimacy, that it's better than sex, that they and their partner, and there are nightclubs, just like there's, swingers clubs and homosexual clubs, there's vampire clubs in large cities, where you can go and you can order a Bloody Mary, and it's really a Bloody Mary. And people go and they hook up with one another, and they drink each other's blood. Now, this might sound totally bizarre to the average person, but yet this is a subculture, if you will, of a subculture. By that I mean, you may have seen or heard of the goth scene out there. These young people that they have black, makeup and wear black leather, and some of them have contact lenses that make their eyes look creepy, and they have spiky hair and they have piercings. This is called the goth movement or the goth scene.